everyone. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another episode of American Mood Swings, where we talk about the brain and all things mental health. I am Dr. Janice Morrow. So grateful that you're here taking your time to join us. And we hope that if you find it helpful, you're uplifted, you gain something to make your life more positive, help you through a difficult situation, that you will share this podcast with your friends, tell them about it, help us to grow, subscribe. And we hope you come back for more. We have lots of great guests lined up for for next year. We talk about all kinds of things here. So thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of American Mood Swings, where we talk about the brain and all things mental health. I'm Dr. Janice Morrow. Today's guest is Dr. Sherman Gillums. We connected here on LinkedIn. He is a disability activist to the nth power. He used to be the executive director of the Paralyzed Veterans of America. He is an executive director at NAMI, National Alliance of Mental Illness. For those of you who don't know what that is, it is the largest grassroots mental health organization in our country. And one particular job that you had that I was very interested in is that looked like you did something with FEMA. And because there's been so many natural disasters the last few years, especially I spent a lot of time in Hawaii, so that's very dear to my heart. And from what I heard, a lot of those fire victims, people with disabilities, there's no plan. I mean, you could barely get out even if you didn't have a disability, but that's something most people don't even think about. And so I want to hear a lot about that. And he's also an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland. So he's quite accomplished, but we're just going to talk about his background and how he became this, disability activist. He is a retired Marine veteran who has served our country. I think you served for 12 years. So go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself, Sherman.
You have summarized just about all the highlights. I will say that the thread that runs through all those experiences, starting in the Marine Corps, when I was injured by car accident in 2002, was a focus on mental well-being. Even though my injuries were physical, I was paralyzed in the accident and see life through pass through life in a wheelchair. But the part that people don't see and the part that's often neglected in those journeys are the mental aspects. And so when I began my work after leaving the military in 2002, I got involved with Paralyzed Veterans of America. I began going to the bedside of all the different veterans who were at that time. Many were injured in Iraq and Afghanistan. I just happened to get injured around that time. So I was interacting with a lot of those folks. And even though I could relate to their the initial part of their journey physically, because we had similar injuries, the part that I couldn't relate to was the profound mental damage that was done to a lot of these men, mostly men. There may have been one or two women at some point, mostly men, that couldn't be repaired by physical rehabilitation or occupational rehabilitation or physical therapy, all those things that are part of the process. And so I began to get interested in not just what happened to them on the battlefield, but also who they were going into the battle, because a lot of the things that come up when you're injured are things that pre-existed your time in the military. So the brain it's like a recorder. It records all this information. And we were only looking at the parts where somebody was in the military as if their life started there. And so that interest pushed me to look further into this idea of disability, also including a mental component. And so that's when I decided to pursue work with AMVETS at that time. We were looking at what we call the HEAL program, which was designed to intervene in cases where suicide was, veterans were at the highest risk of suicide. We needed to figure out a way to, one, understand how they get to that point, and then two, what to do when they get to that point. So I became trained as a suicide intervention trainer. And during those years, it was when COVID happened, and I had to put it to work, but virtually from a distance. I couldn't do the up close and personal work. And then I decided to go to NAMI. I was the chief strategy officer at NAMI and help them sort of reconfigure their operations to address the current demands that were placed on society. They were the largest mental health advocate in the country, but they weren't prepared for a pandemic size mission. And so I came there to
Yeah.
help with that. And then following that, I went to Department of Homeland Security to work as a disability coordinator for FEMA, where my job was to ensure that persons with disabilities weren't abandoned during disasters and evacuations, as was the case in Hurricane Katrina. In fact, the job that I have evolved from what happened during Hurricane Katrina. And so I got to do that for 3 years across 12 disasters. Probably a couple of million lives were part of my role to account for in terms of who was disabled, what their needs were, what their outcomes would be, and most importantly, how they prepare for disasters. So I've got to see many dimensions of disability policy and advocacy. So I continue that work at the Reeve Foundation, where it's kind of coming full circle for me because I started at an organization that focused on paralysis, and now I work at an organization that focuses on paralysis specifically. But building on that work are lessons I've taken at every stop about the importance of looking at mental well-being as sort of the golden thread that ran through just about everything I've done.
Well, your post and your sharing your experiences on LinkedIn kind of brought me in. I have been wanting to have a discussion on disability um, for this podcast because I think about it all the time. I've lost a few friends from ALS or multiple sclerosis. And I hate to even say this, I hope it doesn't sound horrible. But whenever I see, I'm a very active water person, boogie boarder on trampolines every day of my life. So super, super active. And every time I see someone in a wheelchair, I think I couldn't, if anything happened to me when I was watching my friend's demise with ALS, I think, and it's terrible. I'm a devout Christian, and most of my friends, if I even talk about like assisted, we in California, we have assisted right to die. Like but you have to have a terminal illness. But I'm even ashamed to admit it, but I do. And I sometimes I give this blind woman a ride home from the gym. Her name is Susie. We connected at LA Fitness. She's totally blind. She wasn't born blind. It was gradual. But and it started happening in her late 30s. She was married with her husband left her, but it was a condition where she eventually went blind. So she's totally blind now. She takes two buses, which is to me so scary getting on a bus as a totally blind woman. And I give her, when our paths cross at the gym, I give her a ride home. And then my eyes are wide. She looks happy. She's laughing. Was living. But anyway, after I drop her off the whole way home, I mean, I almost wonder if God's putting these people in my path because I think the whole ride home, I couldn't live if I was blind. I wouldn't want to live if I
Yeah.
was blind. So thank you. And let's talk about, and I would imagine that a lot of people, when something happens, that it crosses their mind. People don't talk about it a lot. Although now that I'm on with social media, more and more people are around the globe are talking like with disability activism and raising awareness.
Yeah.
And I'm learning a lot. There's a guy in England that was injured in the war military, and he's gone. He talks openly. He's ups and downs where he's suicidal, but it looks like you've been resilient and been able to have this wonderful life still. So let's talk. I'd love to start
Yeah.
with your Marine journey and like what happened for people that don't know, and then what were your plans? You were in the Marines, you were down in San Diego,
Mhm.
and then what were your plans prior to your injury, and how did that change the course of your life?
So I got out in 2002. So if you recall, right before that, 9/11 happened.
Oh,
And a few years before that, I had just finished my tour of duty as a drill instructor. So I was at that point in my stage mid-career, about 10 years is about mid-career. So I was at that point where I decided I'm going to do the full 20. I went from being enlisted to an officer. I got picked up for the warrant officer program. And so I went and became appointed as a warrant officer one, and then I got commissioned as a chief warrant officer. So all that was happening around that time. And then 9/11 happened. And I think if I recall, I was at least thinking about going reserve because I wanted to be a state trooper in New York State, which is where I'm from. And I thought, I'll go earn some college credits, I'll take the exam. And if I can stay reserve and become a state trooper, that would be more ideal for me. I didn't see a lot happening in the military but as I said, when 9/11 happened, it changed everything. I know we've used that term. It's kind of cliche to say now, but it
Mhm.
really did change a lot of minds in terms of how we look at our purpose as Marines. I think every Marine I knew wanted to be in Afghanistan right then.
Wow.
Nobody wanted to be back home doing, admin work or anything like that. We all wanted to be on the front lines. And and it was also around that time the Marine Corps adopted a new hand-to-hand fighting system. And I had the privilege of going to Quantico and becoming one of maybe 200 across the entire Marine Corps to be trained as an instructor trainer. So you don't want to just face danger. You want to be the danger on behalf of your country.
Right.
And I suppose I got bitten by the same bug. And as I worked my way to getting on a deployment to Afghanistan, leaving the base one day in February of 2002, I got into a car accident. It was almost a freak accident. There was a semi truck that swerved to miss another car that was trying to get his exit. And I swerved to miss both. And I overcorrected, flipped my car. And right then I had broken my neck. I was still conscious. I was told, I think my brain may have blacked out, but I was told that I was still conscious and could give all my information. I don't remember that part where they repaired my spinal cord, and then I woke up maybe 3 days later, and there it was. Um, and I suppose, when you talk about things like, what I would do if I was in a wheelchair, I wouldn't be able to live with myself. The first thought I had was Christopher Reeve. I'll be honest with you. It's sort of um,
Wow. And now you're working here.
serendipitous because he had gotten injured in 1995 and he was the Superman of my youth. And the only person I knew that was paralyzed was Christopher Reeve. I didn't know of anybody else. So I was sort of thinking through what I had seen on television when he had his different, he invited, reporters into his home and talked about the swim therapy. So it wasn't foreign to me. It was sort of like, okay, I've seen this before. He was paralyzed. I kind of started to imagine what does this entail? My body was still recovering. I couldn't feel anything. But the first thought isn't I want to die. The first thought is I'm going to be in that 2% that's going to walk again. You start to
Oh,
think,
that's
you know, that's what you start thinking. And so you're not quite at that point, I think, until about a couple of months in when things don't seem to be getting better. And I think the only thing that salvages any sense of self and purpose and being is when you see other people who have lived with spinal cord injury for a long time and appear to be doing well. And I think that may be why the thought doesn't immediately go to I can't live like this, because you begin to interact with people, at least in the VA system at the VA hospital, who did live like that. And they're very, they're doing sports and they're doing all kinds, they're working, they've got relationships. And to a young man at the time I was 29, the most important things weren't walking. It wasn't whether I was disabled, it was whether I could have a relationship with a woman and or have a family and all those things that are really the things that you think about when you think about being strong and healthy. I'm going to be attractive to someone. I'm going to be able to do all these things. That doesn't really change, maybe a little bit, but it doesn't really change. But you don't know that until you talk to people. So the interaction with people who were already paralyzed and doing well was really, really important in terms of how my self image would take shape. And I suppose that's what spared me from going down that mental path of despair, at least early in my injury.
okay. Well, that's beautiful. I think I've heard that you had kids at the time, or you were a father. So,
Yeah.
how many kids do you have? How old were they, and how has that changed the family? And I wasn't sure if you were married at the time, and if you were, and if you still are, and that. And I was going to ask about dating, and if you weren't married, like, because you just kind of touched on it. So, how many
Right.
kids, and how old were your kids at the time?
When I got injured, my daughter was 2, and my son from a previous marriage was 6, I think. They were fairly young. I had been married. I got divorced. I met my daughter's mom. We were engaged at the time. She was in the Marine Corps also. And that, sort of stopped everything, right? The injury was really me. I was taking a measure of my value to my family and even my kids, and my family, meaning my mother, brother. So everybody was in my family. I was sort of thinking about who am I, because I was used to being the big strong one,
Yeah.
and my kids certainly saw me that way, but they were too young to really appreciate the extent of my injuries. My daughter was just two, and I was just sitting in a chair. She didn't see any difference. So I would get married later, and I would adopt three daughters and have our son later on. But at that time, it was just my son and my daughter, and me trying to figure out fatherhood through that period, about a 10-year period. And my son lived in North Carolina. My daughter lived out in California where I was, and so I was able to navigate that as a parent, show up at the parent teacher conferences, and figure all that stuff out in real time. um, Today she's in the Marine Corps, and so I suppose
Wow.
just being connected, yeah, so she's kind of what you hope is that your kids don't, that they get something out of what they see you going through. You want them to be strong. You don't want that to happen to them. But I do hope that when they were watching me, that they saw that we can persevere through anything, physically, mentally. And a lot of it, because I was in the Marine Corps at the time until I got out, was pride. I didn't want to look weak or seem down. So for my kids, it was always putting the mask on, putting on the armor, and showing them how strong you were. And I suppose I wanted that because I didn't want to see them, um, to see me having down times. But there's not a whole lot of being human in those moments. I didn't show the range of emotions. It was all very stoic. And so I look back on it now and wish I would have been a little bit more expressive and honest in front of them. But my goal at the time was to show them that I couldn't be broken, even if I, in fact, was broken.
All right. Well, and so that daughter, your 2 years old daughter, now she's in the Marine Corps. And are you married? So
Yeah.
you're married now and you adopted three daughters and have a son too?
Well, so my second marriage recently ended, but
Oh,
that's
sorry.
that's beside the point.
Oh,
But
okay.
I've got three daughters from that marriage that are all grown, and we had our son. We were married for 14 years, and that had nothing to do with the injury. This is all just me being a guy like every other guy, and having the same sort of stuff go on that most people have when they're in that situation. But I did have the privilege of raising my five oldest kids to adulthood. And I've got four daughters, one natural, three adopted. They're all, two are parents now. So I've got two granddaughters. Um, but that's been quite the journey, because it did really, um, it did seem more difficult than I think most people would have had it, because I've had to be a parent who has to navigate my own still recovery. It wasn't like everything was easy, but I was still dad. I still had to be a disciplinarian. I still had to, hold them accountable, and being in a chair didn't change any of that. So,
All
and then
right.
my 12-year-old son was born from that marriage through reproductive assistance. So he was our miracle baby.
And where is he? Do you see him? Is he back? It looks like you're on the East Coast. So is he there? Do you get to see him
Yeah,
all? Okay.
he lives with me. Yeah, he lives with me right now.
Oh, nice. Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, then I'll pick a kind of pivot. So, outside of family life, it looked like after the accident, though, and after your treatment, oh, I did want to touch before. I wanted to talk about how you went on to school and finished all these degrees, became a doctor. But I did want to ask at the time, you were in San Diego, so what was your support system other than, because if you're from the East Coast, now that I've learned you were from the East Coast, so you had your girlfriend, your little daughter, but she was two. Was there like a church community or like who was there when you were in the hospital for 6 months? Who was visiting you? Did you, or was it like incredibly lonely, or did you have a support system?
Well, I had a lot of the people that I served with. I was still near Camp Pendleton. I still lived in the area, and they just didn't stop coming to see me.
Oh, I
I had a really good core group of about five or six people that were really, really close to me. And then I had family out there. I have a cousin and an uncle who lived out there.
love.
My uncle was a retired Marine himself, Vietnam veteran, and his daughter and I became very close right before that. So she would come and see me as often as she could. But yeah, I just had a great group of people who just kept me connected to my old identity. And I felt like myself around them. I didn't feel like I was judged or anything, or I was looked at. And we would watch TV. I love boxing, so they would come over. We watch boxing and all the big fights and sports and all that stuff. I got to go to a few San Diego Chargers football games, and the staff at the San Diego VA was also great. They were like family. They became, even after I left the hospital, I was doing outpatient therapy, and the therapists were like family because they had tracked my journey from day one. And I had a great caregiver, Sylvia. She was assigned to me early on and became the only caregiver I ever had for the whole, 10 years or so. And she also became like family to me. So you just kind of grow your sort of orbit of support organically. If people are in that business, they kind of filter their way into your life, and you just hold on to them as long as you can, and they become the reason you push so hard even when you don't feel like it. I didn't want to let them down. But yeah, I think the friends from the military, the the caregivers, just everybody who was around me in that vicinity was the reason why I'm here today.
Oh, great. Beautiful. All
Mhm.
right. Well, let's see. So you go on, you're down there, you went on to graduate, I think it was San Diego, University of San Diego.
Yeah,
And then then you did a doctorate.
yeah,
Was that in education? I can't remember what your
yeah.
a
That
doctorate.
was fairly recently. Yeah, it was in a doctor of education. I during the pandemic, when everybody was sitting in place, I was just antsy. Like I got to do something, and so I began to think about my next sort of occupation, if you will. And I thought I'd like to teach. I want to teach at the college level, but to do that, you have to have either a PhD or a doctoral degree. And so I found a program at University of Dayton that was a hybrid program, and began the journey. It's a 3-year program, and I finished it last year in May, graduated, and then University of Maryland, their global campus, gave me a role as an adjunct to teach communications, and so that's in addition to what I do with the Reeve Foundation. But that it was just part of one of my bucket list items. Teach college, and well, get the degree first and then teach college. But it was just, once I set my mind to it, like everything else, it was going to happen. So I was able to accomplish that last year.
Well, I love that you're teaching. And also, I love to see people with disabilities, I mean, get employed because
Yeah,
just last week or a couple weeks ago, I had a discussion with a woman here. There's a UC Davis has something called the Seed Scholars Program. It's the first program in California, 4-year institution where people with disabilities, intellectual though, lower than 70 IQ, can get like basic. It's not a degree, but they go there for 4 years. They have internships, and then they can become employed because they gain some.
yeah,
Because the stats are like that 80 over 80% of people with disability. I don't know about just physical, but with intellectual disabilities, less than 20% of them are ever self-sufficient and can live on their own. So, and when I think about it all the time when I'm out, because there's all this push for DEI, everything. But in my whole life, I've seen very few people in wheelchairs when I go out shopping anywhere. I don't know if like if I'm at Target or Walmart or anywhere, there's hardly. I mean, I go to the Apple store now on a regular basis to learn how to do the editing for this podcast. And there's I guess I don't know if they still call them dwarf. There's a Sephora, like a makeup store, and there's
yeah,
a dwarf, a man, and he's the first person though that I've ever seen I'm almost 60 that I've ever seen hired who can work out there. And I love it. We need more, representation. They can still do these things. So I'd love to hear about your role at this Reeve. And for people out there, if the Reeve Foundation is the one that Christopher Reeve and his wife Dana set up before. They're both deceased now, but everybody remembers his story. He was injured and became a quadriplegic, and he was a huge advocate. Still, his brain was intact, but he couldn't, if I recall, he
yeah,
had. So let's talk about what you're doing
yeah,
there now, and then I'd love to hear more about, because most people I had never heard of the Americans with Paralyzed Vets of America. I'd love to hear
mm,
about what you did with NAMI, just some of these things so people can learn about the services that
sure.
are out there.
Well, the Christopher Dana Reeve Foundation was the brainchild of it's the namesake of the two people who in the mid 90s showed society what it looked like to live life with paralysis for the first time for a lot of people, right? And so because he had the means and all the access as a celebrity to talk about it, it became an important gateway to understanding a very common condition. I mean, a lot of people get paralyzed a lot more than we think. Not they're not everywhere, but when you're paralyzed, you begin to notice more than you would have noticed before. You kind of walk past them, but when you're rolling, you can see other people. You can see clues on their vans, and you can tell which vehicles were adapted. So they're out there, and Christopher Dana Reeve began this foundation to bring attention to what society lacked in terms of giving opportunities for good quality of life to people with paralysis. It's one thing to be managed with chronic conditions. It's another thing to have quality of life. And there are two different ways of looking at the ideal outcome for people. We don't want to just live with paralysis. We don't want to survive, I should say, with paralysis. We want to live. And there's a difference there. And so what they did is they pressured our lawmakers to begin to think differently about how research is funded, about how programs are set up, what their ideal outcome should be. And when Christopher Reeve died, his wife survived him, and she died later. But she was representing the caregiver voice, and that became important because we look at people with paralysis just themselves, but they're part of a network of support that also needs support. So the caregivers weren't being heard because their whole purpose was being bound to somebody with paralysis. Even today, when you think about Christopher Reeve, I automatically think of Dana Reeve because they were a unit. But not a lot of people pay attention to the caregivers, and especially in the military, where you saw a lot of caregivers whose husbands, in most cases, there were some wives, but they became a caregiver to a person they don't have a medical degree. How do you maintain somebody who's lost two limbs and or has all these things going on without any support? The problem is this was how society had conditioned itself. There were Vietnam era caregivers that were not getting any support that had done this for decades by themselves. And so, in order to get it right, we had to start paying attention to caregivers. So, Christopher and Dana Reeve and the foundation they set up was idealized around the idea of supporting a pathway to quality of life for anybody with paralysis, whether it's ALS, MS, spinal cord injury, some of the developmental disabilities in kids, or some of the afflictions among older adults like strokes that all cause paralysis. There's a way to find quality of life in any of those situations if we're paying attention to the right things. And so that's what it became about for the organization. And even though I had just recently begun working with them, I had been affiliated with the Reeve Foundation for years because there's so much overlap with what I did at Paralyzed Veterans of America. We did a campaign where we were educating emergency rooms on some of the unique needs of people who may appear at an ER with paralysis. And you can't do the same things with them that you do for people with, say, a higher baseline blood pressure. The baselines are going to be lower, and you got to know that because then you're going to be treating them for something that's a baseline for them. And then other things were, exchanging materials, collaborating on research and things like that. So I've had a long relationship with the Reeve Foundation before I came to work for them, starting back at my PVA days. But that, looking backwards, coming from Homeland Security at FEMA, and then before that, NAMI, and before that, AMVETS, and before that, PVA, I was very fortunate because even though the jobs differed, the reason for the jobs was the same. It was about being a voice for people who shared my experience, educating the organization on how they could do better for people who were in my position, if they were veterans or if they had mental illness or if they were disaster survivors. They're still human beings. Even though their sort of status and what we call them may change, their being human doesn't change. So I got to humanize the people that I was responsible for accounting for in all those jobs. And it made it very easy to transition through all those different experiences.
I have so many questions about like how people pay for everything that they need because it can be very expensive. And
Mhm.
in your case, since you're a vet, I'm hoping to hear that everything you need is paid for, from your wheelchairs to upgrading them to like this adaptable van. I hear that they're very expensive.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the resources that are available to
Yeah.
paralyzed people out there.
Yeah. So the Reeve Foundation has what's called the National Paralysis Resource Center that is composed of five different focus areas. One are information specialists that are there to provide the right, it's like a sort of a triage where, somebody will call, need information. They'll give them the information or direct them to the right resource. The second focus area is military and veterans. So that's where we look at veterans who may be caught up in red tape in the VA system. We may have to work with PVA or work with other organizations to help a veteran with paralysis navigate through some sort of barrier to getting what they need. The third is the peer and family support program, where we're matching people up with people who share their experience, but have the experience to talk them through some of the things that they're going through, the newer people are going through. And so that third focus area is important because that's how I became comfortable with the prospect of living life with paralysis, by talking to people who are my peers. Um, the next is a paralysis resource guide, which happened to be the first book I was given as a new injury in San Diego. I call it the Bible of paralysis because it covers all the dimensions of living with paralysis, and it was very important because I was able to find answers to questions that I didn't even know I would need to ask. You know, you talk to your members of Congress, talk to the public, talk to people who make decisions that impact us on a policy front. But those all come together to form the National Paralysis Resource Center, and it's free of charge. Nobody gets charged for these services. It's all federally funded through a competitively administered grant process every year that we have to show our work and compete for that grant every year as an extension of the Administration for Community Living, and their mission is to account for aging and disability programs. So this is one way that they do that, by giving the grant to the Reeve Foundation. But one really important part are the quality of life grants. You asked about grants. We do give grants to community-based organizations that maybe have a project where they're going to open, options for quality of life for people in their communities that can take into account the culture of the community and things like that. So we do empower communities to become self-sufficient. So that's really a big neat part of what we do, because it's not just us doing the work. We're also letting other communities become self-sufficient and find ways to do their own work at the local levels. But that's the thrust of the work that we do at the Reeve Foundation. We've got other areas such as convenings. There's a summit. We get involved in research and find coalition partners on other issues like air travel. Recently, we advocated for a rollback on sort of lowest bidder approach to catheters, right? And having catheters bought on the cheap. And we talked about how that could affect how people manage their bladder program. How, that the bladder program is managing your bladder is key to being able to go to work and sit in a classroom and travel and all these things. But it can be easily taken for granted if folks don't understand that some of the decisions they make have downstream consequences that they may not be aware of. And so we were happy to do that recently. Um, but yeah, the work, it's really busy work, because even though we've done a great job of educating society, there are always more people to educate. And so I get to do that part of it.
Ah, beautiful, beautiful. I think it's almost kind of kismet that when you mentioned earlier that one of the first people that came to your mind when your accident happened was Christopher Reeve. And now here it is, all these
Yeah.
years later, you're working for his fund. I just think that that's like one of those, what do they call it, full circle moments. And even now,
Yeah.
just hearing you talk about the whole bathroom, going to the bathroom issue, people don't talk about it. Like I I'm a huge
Right.
I'm a huge Deion Sanders fan. His comedy, his
Mhm.
confidence, I've really been drawn in. And now that he's been very social about, very outspoken about his cancer treatment. He had bladder cancer and he had to have his bladder. So
Mhm.
he's probably going to be in
Yeah.
diapers, I'm guessing, the rest of his life. But nobody talks about diapers with cancer and how you can lose your ability to go. And he's putting it all out there with in a funny comedic way. But I'm so happy to see that because nobody, and to have this, like, funny, successful, good-looking athlete, good-looking black man
Mhm.
talking about diapers, because it happens to
Yeah.
millions of people and nobody talks. So hearing about this. So what are the resources? Have you I don't know, but I'm guessing you get a disability check. Can you still collect disability
Mhm.
as a vet while you're working? And then do they have they has it been enough to, like, modify your home, wheelchair ramps, make your home accessible? And then I'd love to hear about your situation, but then for somebody who's not in the
Yeah.
military, who's paralyzed, like if I got paralyzed tomorrow, I have Kaiser and they would cover all my
Yeah.
medical stuff, but I don't know. I don't think they'd cover anything like that, like modifications to my home or a wheelchair van. So love to talk about the resources for you and then for people that are not vets. And I want to know if you have everything. Did the government, and since you served for so long, do they take care of the vets with everything you need?
Well, I would say for the veterans who are injured in service, it's considered a line of duty injury, even if it's not combat or even if it's not training, because you're always on duty when you're in the military on active duty. And by the way, car accidents is the number one cause of costly hospitalization among service members. A lot of service members get in car accidents, and so I think probably since the wars have ended, most of the veterans who are paralyzed were paralyzed by car accidents or sports or something like that. But car accidents is a big problem. But when you get injured, and you don't know this until you encounter somebody who works for PVA typically, that you are going to get a compensation check that is pretty sizable, and a lot of that is due to the efforts of PVA who fought for additional monies because the caregiving burden financially is pretty heavy, and we're talking about for a lifetime. And so there's enough money there to, at least pay for all the additional things that you're going to have to cover financially, modifying your home and all that stuff. But there are programs where you can get your home structurally modified. You can get ramps added, things like that at government expense, and vehicle modified. Now they don't count for everything. I still have to. I pay more property tax on my vehicle here in Virginia. So with all those modifications, that's also factored into the cost or the value of my vehicle. So I'm paying higher taxes. We call that a disability tax when you incur more expenses because of your disability. But I guess that's balanced out by the fact that we can get a new vehicle every few years. They wear pretty quickly because of all the additional equipment. So you're not going to have a van for its original life cycle because they weren't made to have all that extra weight added. So if you do enough driving and go to work every day, the wear and tear is going to happen pretty quickly. So the home, the vehicle, education benefits are available to everybody. I did use a GI Bill. I did use vocational rehab. That's how I got the degrees. Well, actually, my last one I paid more out of pocket, but I got to go to the Harvard education program through the GI Bill. So I was blessed to do that. And I'm happy to say that I am a tax-paying citizen. So even though I benefited from the many programs, a lot of us take pride in the fact that even though we were given these grants, we still pay taxes. We're going to pay it forward so that other folks can get their benefits as well. But we're very fortunate because that's unique to veterans. There are some benefits that accrue to your dependents. My kids went to school with additional education assistance, but just having the ability to do an employment program to get your education and to be viable for work is important. But more importantly, I can stay healthy enough to take care of myself. I don't have to be in an institution. I don't have to be in a skilled nursing facility or anywhere where I might need extra help because I can't take care of myself. So, and that's for a lifetime. Once you serve, a lot of folks, that have given up so much more than even I did. I want to see them taken care of for life. I don't want to see them hurting at all. So, But there are veterans who get injured after they get out, and they're not given the same thing. They get injured from a fall or in a car accident. They served, but they didn't get injured while they served. So there's a different set of benefits available to them. They can get health care depending on their, the type of service that he or she had. And PVA was really there to ensure that we level out and bring equity across to all veterans who are paralyzed. And so I was happy to do that for 13 years. And we can do more, but I'm happy to see veterans able to thrive no matter what their status is with paralysis. It's a great model for the civilian community. I don't know how they would set up a similar system for civilians, but there are systems where you can work with your rehabilitation departments locally and get assistance with vehicle modifications. I've seen some programs that states and counties run that if you're pursuing vocational rehabilitation, they can assist you with certain modifications at home. Some projects are tax write-offs. So if you can benefit from having projects done in your home and writing it off because it's over a certain threshold, then you get a tax write-off for certain home modifications. That includes for your kids if they need ramps and things like that because of a disability. So I've had to become educated on all the ways that you can turn a disability into a way to strategize economically to so you're not carrying that burden or the disability tax as I refer to it.
Okay, all great information. I'd like to hear a little
Mm-hmm.
bit about your experience at NAMI. So people out there, again, if you're, it stands for the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They have a lot of free, it's the largest mental health organization in our country. A lot of free resources for people out there. Marriage, kids, online, in person, LGBTQ for veteran, everybody. And it's a great organization. So I'd love to know, yeah, a little bit about what you did for them. And then do you still, I mean, it's been a long time since your accident. Do you ever struggle with thoughts? Well, it didn't sound like you really struggled with suicidal thoughts at all. I'm not getting where I would have for sure. But you must have encountered in all of your years of working with this population, many people who have thought about suicide. So I'm sure I would love for people to hear more about that. And is it a struggle like that goes on and on and on, and resources that are out there to help people with who
Well, I'll start with this. I'll start with the second question because it does tie into why I went to NAMI. It asking someone about whether they struggle with suicide, it's going to be tough because of the stigma. I would openly admit it if I did. I will say that even though I didn't think through a lens of suicide, I did think through a lens of my life had lesser value. And so it was easier to fall into alcoholism, especially as a Marine, where the culture, at least where I was stationed, was defined by alcohol as um, a way to numb yourself to a lot of the pain of life and things like that. And so I took that into the injury, and I didn't actively say I want to die, but I did maybe get to a point where I said, if I die, it wouldn't matter much, right? Because this is going to be tough living this way. And so I would probably say that I was more self-destructive than suicidal, which is different, higher risk. I mean, it's so easy because to slide from being a Marine who was comfortable with alcohol being a daily part of my life, like a lot of Marines I was around, to it becoming medicinal in a way because you can't numb every type of pain, including the pain of feeling ostracized from society by a disability. That was painful, and I think that the way I dealt with that was to drink to numb and to give myself an escape. And that could have killed me, right? And that ultimately would have been a type of suicide, I guess. But I wasn't actively thinking about leaving this earth, but I was thinking about maybe my life didn't have as much value, so it wouldn't matter. I'd be less of a burden, if something did happen. And then you start to hear about all the troops that were dying at the time. And I started to feel maybe a little survivor's guilt in a way because I wasn't getting shot at and getting blown up. they're getting shot at and blown up. So whatever happens to me, it's fine. It's no big deal. So it's easy to slide into that, and you start to see no real reason to stay healthy. Now I was going to school. I had my son and daughter. Later on, when I did get past all that and beat the demons, that's the only way I could connect with people who were caught in that later on. And I decided to go to work for NAMI because at the time the pandemic had happened, all the stuff with George Floyd had happened and all the riots and all that started. And incidentally, I had just finished a suicide intervention training with the Montgomery County Police Department, who had lost 4 police officers to suicide. That had just happened that January. And then when all the stuff happened, there were police officers going through a tough time. And so I thought, man, I can't just sit. And even though this is with, doing important work for veterans, society is hurting right now, and nobody's paying attention to the calls for help mentally. And so NAMI seemed like a good destination. They happen to be looking for a chief strategy and operations officer. I got the job, and I came in. And at the time, the 988 number was the legislation was being rolled out, and there was a big effort to push for that. So I was very fortunate to go and be at the epicenter of a lot of the work NAMI did during the pandemic with some great people who are already doing God's work. What I brought was a little bit of the veteran perspective. I brought some of my expertise in program turnarounds, and restructuring. And so for 3 years before I went to FEMA, while we were locked down during the pandemic, a lot of that work took place, and we focused some of the efforts around justice diversion, for people who were suffering from a mental illness in a situation where the police responded instead of somebody who would have the training to recognize what was happening. If you recall, at the time, there were people getting shot, and it wasn't racial back then. There were, people of all types and all walks were being dealt with by police officers. In fairness to the police, that's what they're there for. They're there to handle what looks like criminal activity. And if they can't make a distinction between somebody having a schizophrenic episode and somebody in a rage that's criminal and a danger to others, they're going to handle it the way they've been trained to. And that's what was happening. And so I was happy to be in a position to learn more about that dynamic, meet with police and law enforcement agencies, hear their concerns. Like, what do you all need more of? And so I met with CIT International, which is, I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but they were one of the biggest
Oh,
membership organizations for.
is that
Mhm.
crisis
Oh,
intervention training? CIT?
yes. Well, yeah, I guess that is it. Yeah, but I guess that's the international body, but that's on the law enforcement side for crisis intervention. So these were very interesting conversations because we were at an inflection point in this country on so many levels. And then to be a part of it, to talking to celebrities, we were talking to people who were, reacting to high profile suicides at the time, that were happening during the pandemic. And Anthony Bourdain, Robin Williams. I mean, there were all kinds of I don't know if it was Miss America. I mean, it was like, what's happening here? These, people are checking out. And so that was why I felt like I was where I needed to be at NAMI, even though it's paralyzed veteran. I had to go into something completely different, because I wanted to know more about, how we move the society in a better direction on that front.
Such a great I mean, breadth of experience. I'd love to kind of
Mhm.
close with thoughts on, I'd love to hear like if there's anything else on your bucket list, because you've done a lot, and what you're doing now, like how, outside of work, how do you spend your time? I think you mentioned you have your 12 years old son lives with you, and then you have some
Mhm.
kids now, but um
Yeah.
that's a beautiful part of life. So let's hear about what's on your bucket list, what any other goals, and how you spend your free time.
Well, most of my time is about figuring out how to keep my son occupied, and so we're looking at, he tried out for football. He did good at it, but lost a little bit of interest. Now we're looking at some other sports, and just keeping him on track in school. I teach, so that's sort of a a way for me to keep out of trouble. But I am writing my memoir, and it's going to specifically focus on my time as a drill instructor, what I learned as a mentor to America's sons as a DI, and how that influenced how I lead today. You know, what I learned about the human condition when you're in a squad bay and everybody's subjected to hardship. Some of the great lessons I took away being a drill instructor, um, and being the person who applied the hardship, you know, why we do that and how we make people resilient. There's a lot that society could take away from what we do at Paris Island, which is where Marine Corps Recruit Depot is located on the East Coast. The other coast was San Diego. But I'm going to write my memoir on that period of my life and what I learned from it, how it informed my own resilience today, you know, in this period of my life. And, you know, and just watching the military, my daughter's, she's a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps now. Some of the things that I saw her class endure through the pandemic and what they're seeing now with social media being such a big influence and all the different dynamics that influence how that generation is evolving. So I've been working on that. That's been my side project. It's called The Street, which is a reference to working as a DI, but it's a memoir focused on, you know, pain and purpose and how those inform, you know, who you become as a more resilient person. And then how that overlays everything that happened after that time that I want young folks to maybe take from and, you know, and find more survivability in hardship. It's bad, but it doesn't have to be tragic depending on how you look at it. A lot of young folks are hurting in many ways, but I want to give them hope and find a way to do that through my own living life experience.
What are some, I love the memoir. I can't wait to read it when it's out. I
Mhm.
would love to hear your thoughts on how can the general public, if we don't know, you're the first, I've seen paralyzed veterans. I didn't have any veterans in my family, so I don't really have any friends that are vets. How can the general public help or be more mindful? What can the average person do to help some of these organizations or things that we're doing wrong that people often might think that they're helping, and what could we do to be more involved to
Yeah.
help with that?
Well, the first thing is to become informed about the life mission of a lot of people. If you go to ChristopherReeve.org, there's a whole host of information about the life of Christopher and Dana Reeve, why they start the organization, the programs we have that help people that they may know, you know, in the future, they may find themselves paralyzed or exposed to that condition through a loved one. But just understanding that there are people who are navigating society that you never see, right? There are people who are deaf. They're walking around here. They're doing sign language right in front of us, but we don't see it because we kind of gloss over what's not familiar to us, or somebody who is blind, and we make it look easy. When I go out in public, I'm just rolling along. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm not broken. I'm just living my life. But people will sometimes just overlook all that. So if your viewers and listeners care to go to ChristopherReeve.org and just immerse themselves in all the stories that we have that are about people who have overcome profound challenges physically, but also spiritually and mentally, and found ways to tap into a deeper part of who they were beyond the body, because that ended up being the strongest part of them. Regardless of what happened outside, internally, they were very strong people. But we've got plenty of volunteer opportunities. We've got marathons, fundraisers. People may want to get involved in the legislative process, but there's so many ways that people might find their own identity in our mission, whether they've been a part of it through lived experience or not. And then just sort of take an interest in what's happening in your community. Begin to look around and notice people who are navigating life differently. They're everywhere. You can look at license plates, you can look at small indicators, but it's like when you become paralyzed, you start to see everybody who's paralyzed around you, whereas before you never would see them. You would just not notice them. That was a sort of weird thing for me. I went to the mall during one outing early on, and it seemed like there were people in wheelchairs everywhere.
Uh,
But before that, I didn't know anybody. I don't even think I've met anybody in a wheelchair before I was in a wheelchair. So I just think that that's probably more about awareness. That's why I don't think that anybody's at fault. It's just not being aware. And so my job is to raise awareness, which is why I'm here today.
Well, thank you. Is there anything else that you want to share that I didn't ask or forgot, anything else?
We hit on a lot of things.
I
Yeah,
know. It means a
I
lot that you took the time to join me. I'm a small podcast
sure.
still. We've had phenomenal guests. And again, if this is about building relationships, I'm still trying to get it out there and hopefully it becomes a
Mhm.
TV show. And if not, it'll be I'll just keep up with the podcast. But it's been great to
Yeah.
foster these relationships. I've learned a lot from people like you and Disability Rights California. And I just thank you. And I am curious where your daughter's stationed. Is she overseas or is she here in the US?
She is in Japan. I just talked to her earlier today.
Ooh,
She's
ooh,
going to bed when I'm getting up, so we'll have little discussions on life and
oh.
argue about just about everything. She's so much
Ah,
like me that it's like talking to myself sometimes. And but I enjoy it because she's, somebody who, if I can't be everything I wanted to be, I want to make sure that my kids can at least have that opportunity, and that's just as satisfying. I'm going to do my thing. I'm going to get my degrees and I'm going to do all that stuff. But a lot of what I'm doing is to show them that life doesn't stop when you get hit with hardship, and hopefully she doesn't endure hardship like I did. But being in the Marine Corps, you're going to see some tough times, and so I'm always happy to just interact with her and keep putting into her the types of things that will need to be there when she does face hardship at some point.
well, I guess it's great thoughts to wind down with because I don't know. I have never met a single person that's not going to have some hardship in their life
Yeah.
sooner or later. Was physical,
Yeah.
and emotional, but
Yeah,
whether
yeah,
whether it's the loss of a family, a lot of people were humbled by job loss,
yeah,
sickness or an illness, you're fine 1 minute and then you're not. But every, just or it might not be to you, but your child or your parents,
yeah,
something they go astray, they succumb to substance abuse, or your parents get Alzheimer's. Everybody out there, and it's good to build resilience. You mentioned some very high profile people and
yeah,
people that you think you do wonder like why somebody we're having our discussion on the morning after these hostages were released all of
yeah,
last night, middle of the night in Israel, people that have been basically tortured and kept underground for 2 years. And
yeah.
all I could think about when I was swimming this morning is how I'm thrilled. I never thought they'd even see one person, that there would even be one person. There's only 20 that are alive or something like that, 19 or 20. Most of them are coming back for their parents to bury, but it's still a closure and they have their loved ones remain. But all I could think about when I was swimming, because it was such an emotional night watching them be released,
Mhm.
is how do you, for like, you'll probably be in therapy your whole life, 2 years underground being tortured by these, Hamas. It's talk about building resilience. I just saw last week one of the survivors that survived the festival. His girlfriend was killed at the festival, and then his mom was killed in the kibbutz. But he's been struggling for 2 years, and he took his life just last week in his car, and that was all over the media. A young man, probably in his 20s. The pain was so, like all these people that you mentioned, the pain. Why do some people? All right, we our goal here with this podcast and you sharing your stories to help people build resilience and through lived experience, shared stories, and talking about things. So I hope that we stay in touch, Sherman. And I'm a keep in touch person. So hopefully, and I wish you well with the Reeve Foundation. We'll put all of that, all these resources on the show, and I'll send you a link when we're edited. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity. And I just want to close with one thought that I tell every person who encounters hardship at the beginning, that your life is meant to be lived, not survived.
Mm.
And it's our job as human beings to find purpose in our pain. And the best way to do that sometimes is to share your story so that it becomes a page in somebody else's survival guide. And then it makes sense. Then why did I go through this? Because I'm going to make sure that other people are equipped So I'm happy to do that here in on platforms like this one. But I encourage anybody who is listening that may be going through a tough time that there is a reason that you're going through this. It is survivable, and it's to get to a point where you're living, not just surviving. But sharing and reaching out is very therapeutic across a lot of different types of pain. So we don't want people to suffer in silence and in isolation. Share your pain and find a way to turn it into something useful, so that your life has meaning beyond what you're going through at the moment.
All right, beautiful sentiments to end with. All right, I wish you a happy holiday season. We're a
Thank
few
you.
weeks away from holidays, and we'll stay in touch. Thank you, Sherman.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.